Detachment also sharpens perception. When emotional investment fades, observation becomes precise. One sees how people reveal their intentions through patterns rather than declarations. How authority relies on recognition more than force. How influence often flows toward those who appear least dependent on it. Detachment creates an asymmetry in interaction. While others seek validation or reassurance, the detached individual remains self-contained. This imbalance subtly shifts power in their favor. Hope encourages endurance of intolerable conditions by promising future relief. Detachment removes this postponement. Without hope as an aesthetic, one is forced to assess reality as it is. This clarity can lead to decisive action, not impulsive escape, but calculated movement. The detached individual does not wait for motivation or inspiration. They act when conditions align and withdraw when they do not, conserving energy rather than wasting it on wishful persistence. Emotionally, detachment brings a calm that is often misunderstood as coldness. In truth, it is economy. Feelings are not suppressed, they are regulated. Joy is experienced without attachment. Loss is acknowledged without collapse. This regulation prevents emotional extremes from dictating behavior. While others oscillate between excitement and despair, the detached individual maintains continuity. This consistency builds inner authority, which others intuitively sense and respond to. Detachment also dissolves the fear of missing out. When one understands that every choice excludes alternatives, regret loses its sting. The detached individual accepts limitation without resentment. They do not fantasize about parallel lives or unrealized versions of themselves. This acceptance stabilizes identity. Without the pressure to become everything, one can become deliberate about becoming something specific. In social environments, detachment acts as a filter. Superficial connections fall away naturally. Interactions based on dependency weaken. What remains is smaller but more intentional. The detached individual does not seek to be understood by everyone. They understand that recognition is rare and unnecessary. This reduces the need for explanation, justification, or performance. Presence becomes sufficient. Ultimately, detachment transforms suffering into structure. Pain is no longer resisted or dramatized. It is integrated into functioning. The detached individual does not expect life to be fair, meaningful, or kind. They expect it to be consistent with its nature. This expectation removes shock. When disappointment arrives, it confirms understanding rather than breaking it. When opportunity appears, it is evaluated without intoxication. Power emerges here not as control over fate, but as composure within it. Detachment replaces hope with clarity, replaces craving with strategy, replaces emotional volatility with steadiness. In a world driven by illusion and expectation, the individual who asks nothing emotionally from reality becomes difficult to destabilize, difficult to manipulate, and difficult to dominate. This clarity extends to human relationships. Awareness reveals how much connection is built on need rather than affection, on fear rather than love. People seek others not to share existence, but to escape themselves. Attachment is often misnamed intimacy. When one sees this, emotional closeness becomes complicated. One cannot fully lose oneself in another when one understands how fragile, conditional, and self-serving most bonds are. This does not eliminate the desire for connection, but it poisons its innocence, adding a layer of sadness to every attachment. Suffering deepens further when awareness dismantles moral illusions. The belief that goodness is rewarded and cruelty punished offers emotional balance. Awareness destroys the symmetry. One observes how unethical behavior is often advantageous, how sincerity is exploited, how integrity goes unnoticed. Justice appears selective, inconsistent, and frequently irrelevant. This realization generates a quiet bitterness, not toward individuals, but toward the structure of existence itself. The world does not align with moral expectation, and awareness removes the comfort of pretending otherwise. Even joy becomes complicated under awareness. Pleasure is no longer pure, it is observed in advance of its decline. Moments of happiness are accompanied by the knowledge of their impermanence. The aware individual does not simply enjoy, they anticipate loss. This anticipation does not prevent pleasure, but it contaminates it with melancholy. Every peak carries a shadow of descent. Consciousness stretches time, allowing one to suffer not only what is happening, but what will happen. Awareness also amplifies empathy, which becomes another source of pain. To see clearly is to recognize suffering everywhere, not just personally, but collectively. One notices exhaustion behind smiles, resentment beneath politeness, fear beneath ambition. This perception makes indifference difficult. Yet acting on empathy is often futile or unwelcome. People do not want their pain understood. They want it validated in familiar ways. Awareness perceives suffering without being able to resolve it, creating a sense of helplessness rather than compassion's relief. The isolation caused by awareness compounds the suffering. Without shared illusions, pain cannot be easily externalized or ritualized. There is no comforting narrative to lean on, no collective explanation that transforms suffering into meaning. The aware individual bears pain privately, without the anesthesia of belief. Even language feels insufficient. Words like growth, lesson, or purpose sound dishonest when suffering is seen as intrinsic rather than instructional. Over time, awareness teaches that suffering is not a problem to be solved but a condition to be endured. This realization strips away urgency and replaces it with heaviness. Life no longer feels like a journey toward resolution, but a series of temporary arrangements around discomfort. The aware individual learns to function despite pain, not because of hope for its elimination, but because resistance only adds another layer of suffering to what already exists. To see clearly is to accept that consciousness itself is a wound. The mind that understands is the mind that suffers most. Awareness sharpens every sensation, extends every disappointment, and removes a protective blur that allows others to move lightly through existence. There is no refuge in ignorance once clarity has taken hold. Suffering becomes not an episode, but a companion, quiet, constant, and inseparable from the act of seeing itself. Power through detachment, not hope. Hope is often mistaken for strength, but it is more accurately a dependency. It ties the individual's emotional state to outcomes beyond their control, creating a subtle form of submission to chance, people, and circumstance. Awareness exposes hope as a psychological leash. The more one hopes, the more one waits. The more one waits, the less one acts from clarity. Detachment begins when this mechanism is understood, not as cynicism, but as liberation from emotional bargaining with reality. Detachment does not mean withdrawal from life. It means engagement without emotional entanglement. The detached individual participates in the world while remaining inwardly independent of its promises and threats. They act, but they do not cling. They observe, but they do not idealize. This internal distance becomes a source of power because it removes vulnerability. When expectations dissolve, manipulation loses its leverage. Praise no longer intoxicates, and criticism no longer destabilizes. Emotional reactions are replaced with measured responses. Most people are governed by hope and fear in equal measure. They pursue approval, status, security, and meaning because they believe these will finally resolve their discomfort. Detachment breaks this cycle. The detached individual recognizes that external conditions rearrange suffering rather than eliminate it. Success brings new anxieties. Stability breeds stagnation. Pleasure decays into repetition. Seeing this clearly, one no longer chases outcomes of salvation. Action becomes strategic rather than desperate. This shift alters one's relationship with power. Power is no longer imagined as domination over others, but as sovereignty over one's own reactions. The detached individual cannot be easily provoked, rushed, or emotionally cornered. They understand that most conflicts are attempts to transfer inner chaos onto another person. By refusing this transfer, they gain control without confrontation. Silence, patience, and restraint become tools more effective than aggression. From an early age, individuals are taught not how the world operates, but how it should be perceived. Effort is promised meaning. Morality is promised fairness. Success is promised fulfillment. These promises are rarely fulfilled, yet they are endlessly recycled because they serve a purpose beyond truth. They keep people invested. Illusions function like currency. The more convincingly one trades in them, the more social value one accumulates. To speak the language of illusion fluently is to gain access to opportunities, approval, and protection. Social interaction itself is an exchange of illusions. Politeness disguises indifference. Confidence masks uncertainty. Optimism conceals fear. People rarely present what they are. They present what is acceptable. Awareness exposes this economy. One begins to see that honesty is not the highest social virtue. Predictability is. Those who repeat familiar beliefs are trusted, regardless of their accuracy. Those who question them are treated as threats, even when they speak calmly and without malice. Illusions are especially powerful because they are emotional rather than rational. They bypass analysis and appeal directly to desire and fear. The illusion of progress soothes dissatisfaction. The illusion of choice disguises constraint. The illusion of moral superiority justifies cruelty. These beliefs are not held because they are examined, but because they are comforting. Awareness reveals that when people defend their beliefs aggressively, they are often defending their emotional security, not truth itself. This is why challenging illusion provokes hostility. When an illusion collapses, it exposes not just an idea, but the emotional scaffolding built around it. A person who loses an illusion does not simply lose belief, they lose orientation. Their sacrifices feel pointless. Their suffering feels unjustified. Their obedience feels foolish. To protect themselves from this psychological shock, people attack the messenger rather than examine the message. Awareness learns quickly that clarity is interpreted as aggression in a system dependent on emotional stability. Power structures understand this instinctively. They do not rely on force alone, but on narratives. Narratives transform exploitation into opportunity, obedience into virtue, and endurance into character. The most effective illusions are those that appear self-chosen. People defend them passionately because they believe the illusion belongs to them. Awareness recognizes that freedom, as presented socially, often means choosing between pre-approved options while believing the choice was personal. Even rebellion is frequently absorbed into this economy. Dissent is repackaged, stylized, and sold back as identity. What appears as resistance becomes another illusion, one that preserves a system by giving frustration controlled outlet. Awareness notices how quickly radical ideas are softened, aestheticized, and neutralized once they gain attention. The system does not fear opposition, it fears uncontainable clarity. Those who refuse to trade in illusions lose social liquidity. They are perceived as negative, difficult, or uncooperative. Their refusal to participate in collective fantasies is interpreted as arrogance or emotional deficiency. Yet this refusal is not rooted in superiority, but in incompatibility. Awareness strips the individual of the ability to pretend sincerely. They cannot offer enthusiasm they do not feel. They cannot praise what they see as empty. This honesty comes at a cost, but it also reveals a true function of social approval, not to reward truth, but to enforce coherence. Illusions persist because they solve practical problems. They motivate labor, justify hierarchy, and soften suffering. A society without illusion would stall under the weight of disillusionment. Awareness does not deny this function, it exposes it. The price of exposure is exclusion. To see illusion as currency is to realize that most human interaction is transactional at an emotional level. Approval is exchanged for agreement. Belonging is exchanged for belief. Security is exchanged for silence. Once this is seen, social life appears less mysterious and more mechanical. Praise loses its warmth. Condemnation loses its sting. One understands that reactions are less about the individual and more about the narrative being protected. Awareness transforms social engagement into observation. It becomes clear that people do not move toward truth. They move toward comfort, stability, and justification. Illusions circulate endlessly because they are demanded, consumed, and rewarded, forming an economy where reality itself has little purchasing power. Suffering as a price of seeing clearly. Suffering intensifies with awareness because perception deepens. To see clearly is not merely to notice more details, but to recognize patterns that cannot be emotionally neutralized. Pain no longer appears as an isolated event, but as a recurring condition woven into existence itself. The aware individual does not simply feel suffering. They understand its structure, its repetition, and its inevitability. This understanding removes the illusion that pain is accidental or temporary and replaces it with the knowledge that discomfort is a fundamental rhythm of life. Most people experience suffering intermittently, buffered by distraction, hope, and expectation. Awareness dissolves these buffers. Distraction loses its effectiveness when one recognizes it as avoidance. Hope weakens when it is exposed as postponement rather than resolution. Expectation collapses when outcomes are seen as indifferent to effort or merit. As these psychological cushions vanish, suffering no longer arrives in waves. It becomes a background condition, steady and inescapable. Seeing clearly means recognizing desire as the engine of distress. Wanting does not lead to fulfillment. It leads to more wanting. Satisfaction, when achieved, is brief and quickly replaced by boredom or new longing. Awareness exposes this cycle mercilessly. The individual watches themselves move from anticipation to attainment to emptiness again and again. There is no comfort in understanding this process, only clarity. Desire loses its romantic appeal and reveals itself as compulsion, endlessly renewing itself without regard for well-being. You feel out of place. You see patterns others ignore. You question things people defend with emotion instead of reason. And instead of feeling free, you feel heavier, lonelier, almost punished for thinking too deeply. This video solves one question. Why does awareness feel like a curse? And how can it become a source of psychological power instead of suffering? Awareness begins as a quiet separation. At first, it feels like clarity, like finally cleaning dust from a window and seeing the world in sharper detail. But clarity quickly turns into distance. The more one becomes aware, the more one realizes that most people are not engaging with reality itself, but with a carefully maintained version of it. Conversations, ambitions, moral postures, even emotions begin to appear rehearsed, repeated, inherited rather than chosen. Awareness creates a gap between the observer and the observed, and that gap widens with every new insight. Isolation does not arise because the aware individual rejects society. It arises because society subtly rejects awareness. A world built on illusion depends on collective agreement, not on truth. Shared beliefs about success, happiness, goodness, and purpose function like social glue. They keep people synchronized, moving in the same direction, tolerating the same discomforts. Awareness threatens this synchronization. When someone sees a mechanism behind the performance, they no longer respond on cue. They hesitate where others cheer. They remain silent where others conform. This hesitation alone is enough to mark them as different. The aware individual begins to notice how language itself is used to conceal rather than reveal. Words like dream, passion, positive thinking, and destiny circulate endlessly, yet rarely describe anything concrete. They serve as emotional anesthetics. To see this is to lose the ability to speak innocently. One cannot repeat slogans with conviction once their emptiness is exposed. This creates friction. Others sense the dissonance, even if they cannot articulate it. Awareness becomes socially uncomfortable, not because it is aggressive, but because it is incompatible with comfortable lies. Isolation deepens when awareness extends inward. One starts observing one's own desires with the same ruthless clarity used on others. Ambitions once believed to be personal are revealed as borrowed. Moral convictions once felt noble are traced back to fear, habit, or self-interest. Even moments of joy are seen as temporary relief rather than fulfillment. This internal observation dismantles the illusion of a stable, coherent self. The aware individual realizes they are not a unified being moving toward meaning, but a bundle of impulses responding to circumstances. This realization removes the emotional shelter most people live under. While others feel strengthened by belonging, the aware individual feels exposed by honesty. They cannot fully surrender to group identities, ideologies, or emotional contagion. Collective outrage feels performative. Collective optimism feels naive. Collective hope feels compulsory rather than sincere. Participation begins to feel like self-betrayal, yet withdrawal brings its own cost. To stand outside illusions is to stand alone, watching others find comfort in what you can no longer believe. This isolation is often misinterpreted as arrogance or coldness. In reality, it is restraint. The aware individual speaks less not because they feel superior, but because they understand how rarely truth is welcomed. People seek validation, not illumination. They want reinforcement of their worldview, not disruption of it. Awareness teaches that offering clarity to those invested in illusion is not generosity, it is provocation. Silence becomes a form of self-preservation. Over time, awareness reshapes emotional connections. Relationships based on shared illusions weaken. Bonds built on mutual distraction dissolve. The aware individual finds it difficult to maintain enthusiasm for rituals whose purpose they see through. Celebrations feel hollow. Milestones feel arbitrary. Even intimacy is affected because most intimacy relies on mutual fantasy rather than mutual understanding. To truly see another person and to be seen in return requires stripping away comforting narratives. Few are willing to do this. The most painful aspect of this isolation is a realization that it cannot be reversed. One cannot unknow what has been seen. One cannot sincerely return to innocence once patterns are recognized. The world does not change back. It only becomes more transparent. Awareness does not evolve into acceptance automatically. It lingers as a constant awareness of distance between appearance and reality, between people and their motives, between oneself and the world one inhabits. Yet this isolation is not accidental. It is a natural consequence of clarity in an environment sustained by illusion. To see clearly is to step out of alignment. To step out of alignment is to lose the warmth of collective agreement. Awareness does not exile the individual deliberately. It simply makes coexistence with illusion psychologically impossible. The isolation that follows is not a punishment. It is a condition of seeing too much in a world that survives by looking away. Illusions are social currency. Illusions are not weaknesses in society. They are its primary instruments. What people call beliefs are often nothing more than agreed-upon distortions that allow large groups to coexist without collapsing under the weight of reality. Truth is too sharp, too destabilizing to function as a social foundation. Illusion, on the other hand, is flexible. It can be shaped, softened, repeated, and distributed in forms that make life tolerable. This is why societies do not reward those who see most clearly, but those who reinforce the shared narrative most convincingly.